Next on News Talk, AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show with Kevin Doran.
It's Brian O'Neill in for Kevin Doran again this morning. State of the Union was last night in Washington, but also last night there were some SAFE Act talks. One was given by Assemblyman Bill Nojay, another by Bob Savage from WYSL 1040 in Avon. He gave a talk to a SCOPE group in Henrietta. SCOPE, the Shooters Committee on Political Education, a group that popped up after the SAFE Act was passed, welcoming now Bob Savage from WYSL.
Well, hello, Brian, and hello, all of my friends down in Hornell. It's always great to talk to the folks, our listeners to WLEA. Have a soft spot in my heart for WLEA where I started 48 years ago, Brian, in broadcasting, there at the big 1480.
That's true of a number of people. Bob Savage, can you tell us what you said last night in Henrietta and how the talk went?
Well, first of all, I hate to start off the interview with correcting you, but SCOPE actually has been around, Brian, for about 45 years.
I was not aware of it until the SAFE Act.
Oh, yes. It's the premier local organization, I should say statewide organization, is the Shooters Committee on Political Education. It's always been out there educating folks on our Second Amendment rights and how key the Second Amendment is to the rest of the Bill of Rights and our fundamental rights as New Yorkers and as Americans. And notwithstanding what Governor Cuomo told us a couple of years ago, which is that people with a conservative viewpoint have no place in the state of New York, we are still New Yorkers. We belong here. We have our rights. This is our home. And fundamental to the rest of our rights of freedom of assembly and speech and freedom from search and seizure and all the other key rights enumerated in the Bill of Rights is the Second Amendment, which is not about hunting. It's about keeping an overreaching government at bay. And that was kind of the theme of the talk with the American Legion last night. Of course, it was a very receptive audience. People who are veterans and members of the American Legion would certainly be supportive of Second Amendment rights. I'd like to start off, Brian, if you don't mind. I sent an email just before that meeting last night to our newly elected state senator, Rich Funke, who many people in your listening area may remember him as a sportscaster and then a news anchor and then later news director at Channel 10 in Rochester. So I wrote to Rich. I've known Rich, by the way, personally for about 43 years. He's a fine guy, and it was our pleasure to help him get elected. Anyway, hi, Rich. Congratulations on your role for response to Cuomo tomorrow night. Of course, I'm talking about how Rich Funke has been selected to give the GOP response to the state of the state. I know I'm not in your district, but nonetheless, I'm hoping to hear some reference tomorrow to a Senate effort to repeal the New York SAFE Act. I think it's important for the state for this divisive, botched legislation to be nullified, and it's significant that 5 Senate members who voted for it have been rejected by voters. I'm personally disappointed that Dean Skelos, he's the, of course, leader of the Senate, the GOP leader, has been silent on the role of pro-Second Amendment voters in returning the GOP to the Senate majority, notwithstanding the frequent refrain from the media that, quote, the gun lobby were MIA in the recent election. It turns out their role in this instance was very important. I'm addressing a meeting of SCOPE NY this evening at the Henrietta American Legion. I intend to remind them all of this. So I got a response back I wanted to share with your listeners, Brian.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, from Senator Funke. Hi, Bob. The message tomorrow is a conference message and not a personal one. Obviously, I disagree strongly with those in the conference who voted for the SAFE Act, and I've already signed on to Marchionne's full repeal bill. Tomorrow's message has to be one of unity, pushing what we all agree on, taxes, economic development, jobs, and so on. Sadly, my analysis after a couple weeks in Albany, get this, folks, is the only way to toss the SAFE Act is decimating it through the courts. Repeal will never pass the Assembly and gain the governor's signature, even if it passed the Senate. The other possible option is trying to strip out the worst parts of it. Mike Nizzolio has a bill like that, but NRA and SCOPE won't accept anything less than a repeal. So that's what Kathy Young and I will fight for as representatives of those who helped us get elected. Best Rich. So that's very interesting, and I think that kind of leads into one of the things you wanted to talk about, Brian.
Bob, if you don't mind, I'd like to take a second and read an excerpt from the Gannett Press and Sun Bulletin, which is out of Binghamton. It doesn't say who wrote this editorial, but here goes. Quote, New York Senate Republicans should stop shooting blanks into the mirage of repealing the SAFE Act. Among the first things Republicans did after taking control of the Senate this month was to tackle the 2-year-old law regulating weapons and ammunition sales. The effort is a large waste of time. Repeal of the SAFE Act has no chance of gaining approval in the state assembly or being approved by Governor Andrew Cuomo, unquote. Bob Savage, your thoughts on that statement, and what did you think of what Rich Funke wrote?
Well, I think that this is a classic case of the irresistible force meeting the immovable object, which is the political realities of what's going on in Albany versus what pro-Second Amendment people are going for, Brian. And I think that, if you think about the political positions of the National Rifle Association and Scope NY, they really do have to, practically speaking, they have to take the position that this law needs to be repealed. They can't push for anything less than that. And at the same time, I think that Rich Funke is correct, and I think that the Sun Bulletin is correct. There's no chance of repealing the SAFE Act. It's not going to happen. We could fight and expend a lot of political capital on getting this thing through the Senate, but it's certainly going to languish in the Assembly, and Cuomo is never going to sign it. So we have to proceed along the lines of what Scope's been doing, and Scope has been quite effective in their legal battles against some of the more egregious provisions of the SAFE Act thus far. So I think that we can be optimistic about that.
Here's another quote from the Press and Sun Bulletin. Improving the region's economy is the single most important issue, not weapons and bullets, unquote.
Well, that's the classic example of the false choice, which gets presented to us over and over again by a left-leaning media. It doesn't have to be either or. We don't have to have either economic development or Second Amendment rights. We really should have both as Americans and as New Yorkers.
Another newspaper, this is from the recordonline.com, an Ulster County newspaper. It's an anti-SAFE Act letter to the editor. Here's what it says, quote, "We do not need a background check. Let's enforce laws on the books, stiffen the penalties for abusers of the law, help people who are deranged," unquote. Bob Savage, your reaction to that?
Brian, we all know that the worst gun atrocities, the worst gun killing, that is to say murders. And I want to make the distinction here between the term shooters, which is a term that frequently gets used in the media, because shooters are people who enjoy their Second Amendment rights and go out and they shoot, trap, and skeet, and they hunt, and they use handguns for personal protection and to protect their families. Those are shooters. Murderers are people who use guns to kill people. And, Aurora, Colorado was a gun-free zone. The Century Theater chain out there had a no-gun policy. Sandy Hook in Connecticut, a gun-free zone. But we had those killings there. West Webster, New York, and on and on. In France, the most recent shootings were 17 people who worked at the satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo were killed by illegal guns. So all the regulation of lawful gun owners in the world is not going to change or obviate the illegal use of firearms. That's what we're talking about. By definition, people who possess firearms illegally are criminals. They are outlaws. They have no interest in the law. So we can, regulate the number of bullets in a magazine, and we can outlaw the sporting rifles like the AR-15 in New York because cosmetically they look scary, and it's not going to help a thing in terms of controlling crime. And I think that the letter to the editor makes a good point, and that is that we need more. We need to make it easier to commit people who are clearly crazy.
We're talking with Bob Savage from WYSL 1040 in Avon here on the Newsmaker Show. When we get back, we'll continue our conversation about the SAFE Act.
Fox News Radio, I'm Lillian Wu. The president announcing the state of our union is strong.
With a growing economy, shrinking deficits, bustling industry, booming energy production, we have risen from recession freer to write our own future than any other nation on earth.
And that future, he believes, should include help for the middle class, part of the agenda he unveiled last night, when he also promised to veto attempts to roll back his health care law.
For Republicans like Texas Senator Ted Cruz, the president's speech failed to hit the right conciliatory tone.
He came back and doubled down on the same failed policies.
President Obama has said he's hopeful that bills can be passed this year on trade and cybersecurity.
Fox Radio's John Decker. And a high school basketball coach in suburban Atlanta accused of biting another coach in the eye and nose. Her attorney says she never touched him. Fox News. We report, you decide.
Office space isn't something you think about until you need it. Then it's all you think about. Leases, locations, logistics. Every detail takes you away from running your business. But Regis makes it easy. With one call, you can get furnished offices and support staff wherever and for however long you need them. From short-term to long-term. All on your terms. So let Regis take the hassle and expense out of setting up your office so you can focus on your business. Regis, the new way to work. Call 1-800-OFFICES.
Your favorite celebs are challenging you to change the world.
I challenge you to shave your head to fundraise for cancer research.
I challenge you to eat a hot pepper to raise awareness for global warming.
Whatever your cause, take a challenge and get it noticed. Download the WLEA 365 app for free and change the world one challenge at a time. Each download helps give goats to provide income to families in developing countries.
Get WLEA 365. Change the world every day.
The Newsmaker Show with Kevin Doran. News Talk AM 1480 WLEA and online at AM1480WLEA.com.
Back on the Newsmaker Show, Brian O'Neill in for Kevin Doran today. We're on the line with Bob Savage at WYSL. Bob, there's a lawsuit in the Rochester Federal Court right now. A man named Donald Montgomery, who's a Navy vet, a police officer, he says he ended up on the mental health list because of a mistake made by a hospital worker who apparently accidentally wrote down that Donald Montgomery was an involuntary admission. He was suffering from insomnia. Apparently that was not true, that he was an involuntary admission. So Montgomery is suing because he lost a pistol permit because of that. Bob Savage, you're an attorney in addition to working in radio. Any thoughts on this sort of slip-up in the system like we just mentioned?
Well, yeah, appreciate you having me on the show again, Brian, and certainly I think that this points out one of the more sinister aspects of the SAFE Act, and a lot of people don't realize that because you don't get to look over your doctor's shoulder when you go to your doctor or when you're checking into a hospital or an emergency clinic or whatever. They're always staring at a screen now. You notice that. And, of course, this is because of the Affordable Care Act. But what you may not realize is that when they're entering your data and you're telling them why you're there to see them, you're not feeling well, or in the case of Donald Montgomery, he had moved to a new home and was having trouble sleeping, so he had come down with a mild case of insomnia, and he was looking for treatment for that. As that doctor or that nurse practitioner is tapping away on that laptop while he or she talks to you, down at the bottom there's a button they can click on which says New York SAFE Act. Clicking on that button opens a collapsible window in which they write a narrative about what they see. That information, ladies and gentlemen, goes, if it relates to firearms and mental health. For example, somebody says they're depressed. They're going through a divorce. They've lost their job. Their home's being foreclosed, or whatever, slings and arrows life is throwing at you. Sometimes it affects some people in a way where they need some medical assistance, some intervention, some medication. This does not mean that they're crazy or that they're not competent to own or hold a firearm lawfully owned by them. So what happened in the case of Mr. Montgomery was the information went to the state police that he had been involuntarily committed. Now, you also have to understand that, again, another part of the Affordable Care Act is tens of thousands of medical code entries. There's I'm exaggerating for effect here, but 66 different codes for a hangnail. And it's very easy for a hurried healthcare worker, a doctor, a nurse practitioner, to enter the wrong code, and that's what happened to Mr. Montgomery. What was a voluntarily seeking treatment for insomnia got entered as involuntary commitment. So 4 days later, the local sheriff on Long Island comes and knocks on Mr. Montgomery's door and demands that he produce all of his weapons, including his former service revolver, because as you pointed out, Brian, he's a law enforcement officer, retired cop. And this is a huge violation of our constitutional rights. We're talking not just the Second Amendment, we're talking the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the 14th Amendment. And it's also a violation of HIPAA rules, because HIPAA rules are supposed to guarantee that our medical information remains strictly confidential. But here, thanks to the New York SAFE Act, information that may be completely erroneous just goes directly to the state police. And this is an intolerable. To make it all the more intolerable, when Mr. Montgomery contacted the police and wanted to know, well, what exactly is it? What are the records that you're referring to? Why are you concluding that I have some kind of a problem that makes me incompetent to possess firearms? They said he couldn't know. He couldn't know his own information, but the state police gets around HIPAA and gets access through the SAFE Act. This is egregious and it's wrong, and that's why this is the subject of litigation right now.
Wow. Buffalo News reported on a SAFE Act arrest. It was thrown out of court by a judge in February of last year. What happened, apparently, according to the Buffalo News, a Lockport man who was arrested says police went through his car at a pullover without any reason to. That's my understanding of it. The judge ended up signing with the Lockport man. Your thoughts on that case?
Well, yeah, this related, actually, there's a little bit more to that case. And this related to the restriction on 7 rounds in a magazine, which has been tossed by a Western New York court, restoring the 10-round limit. What happened was this guy's riding in a car with his girlfriend. His girlfriend's driving, and she has a taillight out, or she has a turn signal out. And so she gets pulled over by a cop, and the cop sees that this gentleman has a handgun. So the cop asks, are you a registered, a pistol permit holder? And he said yes, and produced his permit. And then the cop, now this is instructive for our WLEA listeners, don't ever do this. The cop says, can I see the gun? Of course, the appropriate response to that is not without, with of course, respect for law enforcement officers. No, officer, I'm afraid not. Here it is, not without a search warrant. Anyway, the cop takes the handgun from this guy, and he hefts the handgun, and he says, feels too heavy. He ejects the magazine. The magazine has 10 rounds in it, whereupon the cop directs the boyfriend to get out of the car, put his hands on the roof, pats him down, cuffs him, and hauls him away for violation of the SAFE Act. Huge violation of your Fourth Amendment rights against search and seizure, and ultimately the case did get tossed, but largely because of the fact that the SAFE Act got modified by judicial decree. In other words, the 7-round limit got nullified as arbitrary and capricious. But the funny twist on this whole thing, Brian, is that this kid is still trying to get his gun back.
That's amazing. Syracuse Post, they had an article about the SAFE Act. I wanted to get your take on this. It said most gun arrests related to the SAFE Act since it passed were violations of old rules that were there before the SAFE Act. Two questions here. One, do you believe the premise being put forth by the Syracuse Post that most of the SAFE Act arrests are for violations of things that were already on the books? And two, do you think that if the story is true that was in the Syracuse Post, does it prove that the SAFE Act was unnecessary?
Well, I don't have at my fingertips. I don't have the information available to me to prove or disprove that most of these violations would have been violations prior to the SAFE Act. I'll put it this way: it wouldn't surprise me. And is the SAFE Act an unnecessary law? The SAFE Act is strictly 100% New York State progressive politics. This is all about the appearance of doing something about people who kill other people with guns, not the reality. The truth of the matter is that legal concealed carry gun owners who have that concealed carry permit have a record of violent crime, less incident of violent crime than law enforcement officers do. In other words, more cops get arrested for violent crime than handgun owners. So it's ridiculous to have this huge, unwieldy, privacy-invading, unconstitutional law. It's just Andrew Cuomo politically posturing and pandering to the political left.
Bob Savage from WYSL 1040. We're down to just a couple of minutes. Anything that we didn't bring up that you'd like to mention?
Yes, it's very important. Now, there is some truth to the observation that gun owners did not turn out in sufficient numbers in the most recent election, and unfortunately, I think that there's an attitude out there of fatalism and defeatism where people think that we can't do anything about returning traditional values and conservative values to Albany. You have to get out there, folks. You got to vote. You can't just say you can't subscribe to the theory. It doesn't make any difference. My vote doesn't count anyway. The vote that doesn't count is the one that you don't cast. And furthermore, don't reelect people who are idiots. If you're elected people. If your elected officials do not reflect your values, vote them out of office. Primary them, find better candidates.
Bob Savage, I want to thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmaker Show this morning.
My pleasure, and I want to send a quick shout-out to your dad, to Kevin Doran. Kevin, get better. We're thinking about you.
I'm glad you brought that up. Kevin, he was at St. James. He had 3 slip discs. He had 3 slip discs and then caught double pneumonia. He was at St. James. Eventually, they transferred him to Strong, where he had back surgery. He's doing very well. And thanks, everybody, for all the cards and well wishes. Now he's back at Hornell Gardens getting rehab. Bob Savage, thanks a lot for coming on today.
Thanks very much, WLEA listeners. It's great to talk to you again. And hang in there and Godspeed.
Thank you very much. Bob Savage learned a lot this morning on the Newsmaker Show. Bob Savage from WYSL 1040, our guest. I'm Brian O'Neill, 9 o'clock time for ABC News here on AM 1480 WLEA Hornell.